Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us for the second part of our story. Let's jump right back in. I left the office without a word, ignoring my secretary's puzzled expression, and drove straight out of the city. My mind raced as I processed the situation. Three things became painfully clear. Doug had cracked under pressure and confessed to Sandman. Sandman now knew everything. And worse, he would stop at nothing to eliminate me for ruining his plans. I had one option: vanish. I drove straight to the beach house of my former sergeant, Brian Moses, a man with connections and a knack for making problems disappear. He was lounging near the shoreline when I arrived, a cold beer in hand, his expression calm as ever. "Lieutenant, what brings you here?" he asked, surprised but curious. "I need your help, Brian. I need to disappear." No questions asked. He didn't press me. One look at my face told him this was serious. Without a word, he made a call, then took me inside and snapped a few photos to create a new identity. We avoided heavy topics while we waited, sharing a meal as if it were just another day. An hour later, a guy showed up with the necessary paperwork. Brian handed me a new identity and offered me a place to crash for the night. As I sat on the couch, trying to clear my head, my thoughts drifted to Kelly. I couldn't shake the nagging fear that she was still in danger. I made the call. She picked up immediately. "Kelly, listen to me carefully," I said, my voice low and urgent. "You need to leave the hotel. Now, don't go home, don't go to your parents, don't go to mine. Just leave." She laughed nervously. "Roger, what are you talking about? Are you drunk?" "No, Kelly. Just listen. Stay away from Sandman. He's not who you think he is, and you're not safe." "Why would I do that?" she asked, her confusion evident. "Because I know everything, Kelly," I said, my tone hardening, "including the fact that the baby is Sandman's." I paused, letting it sink in. "You've been warned." Before she could respond, I hung up and smashed the phone against the counter. I knew it was the only way to avoid being tracked. My parents crossed my mind briefly, but I convinced myself that Sandman's primary focus was on me, Kelly, and General Bates. That night, after a few stiff drinks with Brian, I went to bed. The next morning, I handed over $10,000 and walked away with a new identity, Justin Green. All the documents were in order. But before I could begin my new life, Roger Easton needed to die. I had a plan. Years ago, a soldier under my command had told me about his corrupt hometown, a small place called Hell. It had a lazy, incompetent police force and few serious crimes. Perfect for my needs. That night, I drove to a nearby town with a small morgue. A quick bribe to the night attendant got me access to the John Doe bodies. I found one that was roughly my size and build. Another bribe ensured the attendant would forget I was ever there. The next day, I drove into Hell, booked a motel for 4 nights, and made sure to be seen around town. I introduced myself to locals, chatted with the mayor, and told anyone who'd listen that I was just passing through. Later, I found the perfect spot for my staged death. A notorious cliff just outside town, known for the many lives it had claimed over the years. Everything was falling into place. I bought a dirt bike from a nearby farm and stored it in the back of my truck. That night, I hit the local bar, a seedy but lively place. I bought rounds for the crowd, cracked a few jokes, and made myself memorable. The next morning, I scouted the cliff again and hid my dirt bike, helmet, and a change of clothes nearby. The plan was almost foolproof. Saturday night arrived. I headed back to the bar, played the part of the drunken out-of-towner, and kept buying shots. I barely drank, but no one noticed. I had them convinced I was completely hammered. At one point, the bartender suggested I hand over my truck keys. Thinking fast, I threw $500 on the bar and shouted, "Drinks for everyone!" As the crowd surged, I slipped out and staggered to my truck, keeping up the act. Once I was out of sight, I drove to the cliff. I parked near the edge, retrieved the John Doe body, and dressed it in my clothes. Then I soaked the truck and the body in whiskey, opened the fuel tank, and placed a fuel-soaked rag inside. I started the engine, lit the rag, and watched as the truck rolled toward the edge. plummeted down the cliff and exploded on impact. I didn't wait to see the flames die out. I hopped on my dirt bike and rode off into the night. By dawn, I was back at Brian's beach house. He'd arranged a new vehicle for me and offered me a place to hide. A remote cabin near a town called Last Chance. Felt fitting. Before I left, Brian handed me a burner phone. "Only use this to receive messages from me," he warned. "If you ever get an emergency text, leave immediately." I drove to the cabin, a small but sturdy structure hidden deep in the woods. It was isolated, quiet, and perfect. Brian had stocked it with enough supplies to last a month. For now, all I could do was hope that everyone believed Roger Easton was dead. I settled into a routine, running long distances on the trails and working out daily to get back in shape. 3 weeks later, I received a text from Brian. "Roger Easton is dead. Funeral next week. We'll watch over your family." Guilt weighed heavily on me, but I reminded myself it was necessary, for their safety and mine. A few days later, I finally worked up the nerve to watch the video Sandman had sent. It was worse than I imagined. Doug had been tortured until he broke, confessing everything, including my involvement. The masked figure doing the torturing was unmistakably Sandman. At the end of the video, Sandman delivered a chilling message. "I'm coming for you, Roger. And when I'm done, I'll destroy everything you hold dear." I stared at the screen, seething with rage. This wasn't just a threat anymore. Sandman had crossed a line, and now it was personal. His ability to switch his rage on and off terrified me. It wasn't just that he was dangerous. It was that he wouldn't stop until his enemies were obliterated, and I feared my family was next in line. I couldn't live in fear forever. Motivated by that horrific video, I intensified my training, pushing my mind and body to their limits. By week 5, I was ready to test the waters. I kept a low profile during my first trip to town, quietly purchasing supplies and a laptop with internet access. I also bought a 7mm semi-auto rifle, a 9mm SIG P228, and enough ammunition to handle whatever might come my way. At a pawn shop, I picked up an old boxing bag and gloves. Anything to keep my hands busy and my reflexes sharp. On the way back to the cabin, a roadside sign caught my attention. "Puppies for sale." Something about it made me stop. Moments later, I found myself driving home with a black and white border collie puppy. I named her Jess. She was more than just a companion, she'd be my early warning system. Back at the cabin, I set up my new equipment, fed Jess, and settled in for the night. Later, I searched online for any news about Roger Easton. A small-town newspaper article popped up. "Drunken man plunges to death near hell." According to the report, Roger Easton, a visitor known to locals, had gotten drunk, driven off a cliff, and perished in a fiery crash. Sheriff Baxter had confirmed there was no foul play. The story was exactly what I'd wanted. My death had been accepted at face value. The only other mention of me was in articles about my funeral. The plan had worked, at least for now. For the next 6 months, I lived in complete isolation with Jess as my only company. I ventured into town just once a month, and by then, people had nicknamed me Grizzly Adams thanks to my long hair and scruffy beard. I trained relentlessly, regaining my military fitness and sharpening my shooting skills. I stayed off the grid, only occasionally checking my phone for updates from Brian or scanning the internet for signs that Sandman was still hunting me. One hot July afternoon, I stumbled upon a troubling update. The Easton family hardware store had burned down under suspicious circumstances 5 months earlier. The new owner had kept the Easton name, but I knew this wasn't a coincidence. Sandman hadn't forgotten about us. As I scrolled further, my stomach dropped. I found a piece about a wealthy family struck by a string of tragic deaths, events the reporter compared to the infamous Kennedy curse. It began with the death of Susan Bates, who, according to the article, had fallen down the stairs while drunk and broken her neck. On the day of her funeral, her parents, General Bates and his wife, died in a car accident on the way to the service. Kelly Bates Easton was now the sole heiress to the Bates family fortune. The article described her as deeply traumatized, still reeling from the recent death of her husband. Something about the report felt off. My death had been reported as an accident, yet this piece framed it as a suicide. Was it possible Kelly knew more than she'd let on? Two other stories caught my eye. The first was a wedding announcement. Kelly Bates Easton had married Greg Sands a month ago. The second was about Douglas Peterson Sr., who had suffered a heart attack and been airlifted to a hospital in the city. The more I read, the clearer it became. I couldn't hide any longer. Sandman wasn't done, and if I didn't stop him, more people would die. My first stop would be the hospital to see Peterson Sr., followed by a long-overdue visit to Sandman. I packed my gear, grabbed my SIG P228, and put Jess in the truck. She sensed my tension and stayed close as we drove to Brian's beach house. We arrived in the afternoon, and Brian didn't recognize me at first. But Jess, tail wagging furiously, gave me away. "Lieutenant, nice look, Bigfoot," Brian joked as we embraced. After settling Jess with water and snacks, I sat down with Brian and laid everything out. The affair, Kelly's pregnancy, Sandman's threats, faking my death, and the recent string of deaths and suspicious events. I also showed him the articles I'd collected. Brian's expression darkened as he pieced it all together. "Sandman's gone rogue," he muttered. "Special forces guys like him, they don't mess around." "I know," I said, "but I can't keep running. I have to end this." Brian offered to help, but I insisted he stay out of it. Instead, I asked him to protect my family if things went sideways. After some convincing, he reluctantly agreed. "Can you even take him out?" he asked, his concern obvious. "If it's kill or be killed, I'll have to," I replied. The odds weren't great. I knew that, but I had no choice. As the saying goes, evil triumphs when good men do nothing. I'd run long enough. It was time to face the music. That night, I drove back to the city where I'd lived and worked for years. I checked into a cheap hotel, dropped off my gear, and texted Brian to let him know I was safe. My plan was to visit Peterson Sr. at the hospital, but not during regular hours. By the time I arrived, visiting hours were over just as I'd planned. My scruffy beard and long hair helped obscure my face from the security cameras. I knew the hospital layout well and had already confirmed that Peterson Sr. was in room 319 on the 3rd floor. I avoided security, slipped into the restroom, and waited until the coast was clear. Then, quietly, I made my way to his room. When I stepped inside, I found him pale, frail, and hooked up to a web of monitors. I sat down in the corner, intending to wait, but I must have dozed off because I didn't hear the nurse until she was leaving. As the door clicked shut, a raspy voice broke the silence. "Come closer. Let me see the face of my killer, Mr. Sands." Startled, I moved toward the bed and turned on a small light. He squinted at me, his face twisted in disdain. "So Sands farms out his dirty work now. What a gutless coward. Get on with it." "I'm not here to kill you, old man," I said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. "Easton?" he rasped, his voice shaking. Tears welled up in his eyes. Not tears of fear or pain, but of relief. Despite our past, he seemed genuinely glad I was alive. We talked until morning, and by the time I left, I had two things: a key to a safety deposit box and crucial information. Back at the motel, I texted Brian and collapsed into bed. When I woke up around 11 a.m., I showered, grabbed a quick bite, and called the hospital. Peterson Sr. confirmed that I could access box 112 under my new identity, Justin Green. Before heading to the bank, I stopped at a barbershop. I wasn't hiding anymore. By the time they were done, I barely recognized myself. Leaner, stronger, and with a clean-shaven head, I looked every bit like the man I needed to be. At the bank, I was treated like a VIP. When I unlocked the deposit box, I found two things inside: a large envelope and a significant amount of cash. Back at the motel, I sank onto the bed with some takeout and tried to process everything. My conversation with Peterson Sr. had been a revelation, shedding light on the darkness that had spiraled out of control after my supposed death. One thing was clear: Greg Sands had wasted no time escalating his plans. With Doug and me both out of the picture, General Bates had become Sandman's primary target. And Kelly? After that last phone call, she hadn't run for her life as I'd hoped. Instead, she had run straight into Sandman's arms. According to local gossip, she'd been telling anyone who would listen that I had abandoned her the night I died. Sandman and Kelly were now openly together, basking in their victory. But Sandman wasn't satisfied. He had wanted to take me out personally, and my survival, even in secret, was a loose end he couldn't stand. With me gone, however, there was only one person left standing between him and total control: General Bates. Peterson Sr. had assured me that the key to everything lay inside the safety deposit box. He was grieving, furious over his son's murder. But even with his money and influence, he couldn't touch Sandman. So he had done the next best thing. He'd opened a private investigation into Sandman and Kelly Bates. This time, he spared no expense. Kelly had wasted no time dropping the Easton name, and Peterson was determined to uncover the truth. His original plan had been to use me as a weapon, a means to strike back at Sandman. But then I died, and he turned to more desperate measures, even considering hiring mercenaries to take Sandman down. My sudden reappearance had changed everything. Seeing my determination, Peterson Sr. had decided I might be his best shot at revenge after all. He called it bloodlust. And, disturbingly, he seemed to have more faith in my ability to stop Sandman than I did. I promised to keep him updated and left with the key, unsure of what I'd find. That night, I sat down in front of the thick report from the deposit box and started reading. At first, much of it was information I already knew, but as I kept going, the details grew darker and more personal. Peterson Sr. must have spent a fortune gathering this intel. Page by page, the full scope of how I had been manipulated came into focus, and the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Greg Sands and Kelly Bates had been drawn to each other from the very beginning. The hatred between General Bates and Sandman was real, but contrary to what I'd initially believed, Kelly hadn't rejected Sandman. In fact, they'd planned to elope. Sandman had even intended to leave the military and become a cop. But then the general found out. Determined to sever the relationship, General Bates had pulled strings to deploy Sandman's unit to the Middle East, hoping he wouldn't survive the mission. When Kelly kept writing to Sandman, the general threatened to have him sent back in a body bag if she didn't cut ties. Fearing her father would follow through, Kelly broke things off, leaving Sandman devastated. During a brief R&R, Sandman tried to see her, but the general had him reassigned to a deadly mission. Though he made it out alive, he wasn't the same man. Bitterness and rage consumed him, and when the general was eventually forced to resign, Kelly never forgave him. By the time Sandman returned to civilian life, he had two goals: reclaim Kelly and destroy anyone who stood in his way. And then there was me. I had been nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game. Kelly, who was close to her cousin Susan Peterson, already knew all about me before we'd met. She came to the festival with one goal in mind: marry me. It was a way to stay connected to Sandman while keeping up appearances. When our marriage lasted longer than she'd intended, Kelly tried to sabotage it, pushing me away emotionally in the hopes I'd leave. Her ultimate plan was for Sandman to return, get jealous, and win her back. Much of the report's intel came from Susan, who, after Doug's death, had spilled everything Kelly had ever confided. Sandman's military training had made him dangerous, but his rage over Kelly and the general made him lethal. After reconnecting with Kelly, they resumed their relationship in secret. When Kelly became pregnant, she saw it as the perfect opportunity to provoke me into leaving or killing Doug Peterson. But when I discovered the pregnancy, I knew something they didn't. I was sterile. That revelation shattered everything. It confirmed the affair, and worse, it made it clear that Sandman had been involved from the beginning. Desperate for revenge, I'd approached Sandman for help, unknowingly walking into his trap. He had doctored reports on Kelly to keep me distracted while he set up Doug on bogus drug charges. The plan had been for Doug's arrest to drive me over the edge, pushing me toward divorce or worse. Then Sandman could swoop in, take Kelly, and destroy the general's legacy. But Kelly's lie about the pregnancy changed everything. I knew Sandman was manipulating me, so I sabotaged his plan by protecting Doug instead. That infuriated Sandman. He hunted Doug down, tortured him, and learned the truth. I had outmaneuvered him. Enraged, he sent me the video package to provoke me into a reckless move he could exploit. And then I made the phone call that changed everything. When I warned Kelly to run, she told Sandman I had left town. They assumed I'd fled in fear, and when I faked my death, they celebrated. With me out of the way, they turned their attention to the general and anyone else who posed a threat. But someone had been asking questions. Susan Peterson had started talking, and when Sandman and Kelly found out, they decided to eliminate her and her family. Susan thought her wealth would protect her. She was wrong. One night, she went out for the evening, and when she returned, Sandman was waiting. He broke her neck and staged the scene to look like she'd fallen down the stairs while drunk. Then, they sabotaged the general's car, ensuring it crashed on the way to Susan's funeral. Just like that, the Bates family was gone. Kelly inherited everything: wealth, political connections, and power. And after a brief mourning period, she and Sandman finally married. The only hiccup in their plan was Kelly's mishap. Whether it had been a natural loss or something more sinister, perhaps because they suspected the baby wasn't Sandman's, I'll never know. Either way, it didn't matter. Sandman likely had Peterson Sr. in his crosshairs next, but fate handed him a lucky break. The old man's sudden heart attack meant one more obstacle removed, without Sandman having to lift a finger. Sitting alone in that dingy motel room, I considered walking away. After everything I'd learned, it would have been the easiest option. But then I thought about my mom, dad, and sister. Sandman wasn't the kind to just sit on his laurels. If he got bored, there was a good chance he'd turn his attention to the rest of the Easton family. No, as my dad always said, when you've got a diseased dog, the most humane thing you can do is put it down. I woke up the next morning wondering if it would be my last day alive. After a long, hot shower, I called Brian to bring him up to speed. "I'm going after him," I told him. "I'm heading to the Bates mansion. He and Kelly moved in right after her uncle and aunt died. He's on leave, so he should be there." Brian didn't try to talk me out of it. Instead, he thanked me and promised to look after my family, including Jess, if things didn't go as planned. That was Brian, always solid. The rest of the day was spent resting and preparing. When night fell, I dressed in black, checked my weapon one last time, and left the motel. As I drove through town, memories of my past with Sandman played through my mind. Strange how life had come full circle. I parked a few streets away from the Bates estate, grabbed my gear, and made my way toward the mansion. The layout was burned into my brain from high school days spent there with Susan, so I reached the perimeter quickly. Through night vision goggles, I spotted Kelly pulling out of the driveway in her BMW. I waited 5 minutes to make sure she didn't double back, then moved in. Peeking through a window, I saw Sandman sitting at the dining table, a glass of wine in one hand, papers spread out in front of him. I slipped inside through the garage, keeping low as I crept toward the kitchen. He hadn't heard me. His back was to me, completely engrossed in whatever he was reading. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I raised my weapon, preparing myself for what had to be done. But just as my finger tightened on the trigger, Sandman tensed and dropped to the floor. Somehow he'd sensed me. My first shot missed, and before I could fire again, Sandman whipped around and squeezed off a shot of his own. Pain exploded through my shoulder as the bullet tore through me. I staggered back, realizing with grim clarity that he'd been armed the entire time, even while on leave. I was outmatched. Bleeding and in agony, I scrambled for the garage door, firing blindly over my shoulder to buy time. But then, the lights went out, and I tripped, crashing hard onto the floor. For shots slammed into the door where I'd just been. Fear gripped me. Sandman was coming for me, and I was losing blood fast. I knew I wouldn't make it out alive, so I decided to go down fighting. I fired toward where I thought he might be, but there was only silence. Then suddenly the driveway lights flickered on, and there he was, sprawled on the floor, dazed from a graze to the head. Between us lay a knife. I lunged for it just as Sandman stirred, shaking off the fog. "Never bring a knife to a weapon fight, Roger?" he sneered, raising his gun. But before he could pull the trigger, blood sprayed across the walls, and Sandman crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Brian had arrived just in time. He rushed over, dragged me outside, and applied pressure to my wound to stop the bleeding. Then he went back into the house for a few minutes. When he returned, he helped me into the car and drove us away at high speed. When I finally woke up, I was lying on a bed in Brian's house, sore but alive. A retired doctor friend of his had patched me up while I'd been unconscious. I'd been out for days. And Sandman? He was dead. I went back to the cabin with Jess to recover, keeping a low profile while following the news. Greg Sand's death was ruled as a home invasion gone wrong. The police said there were no leads and closed the case. Brian had erased any trace of my involvement during those 5 crucial minutes inside the house. Sandman even got a hero's funeral. But dead was dead, and that was all that mattered. I'd planned to confront Kelly, but she beat me to it. In true Kelly fashion, she made a grand exit, taking her own life with Sandman's weapon. She left a note claiming she couldn't live without him, but to me it felt hollow. I didn't even get to end it on my own terms. She always had to stay one step ahead. Now, Jess and I are driving to Brian's beach house for a family reunion. Roger Easton is still dead, but Jess doesn't care, as long as Justin Green survives. As I drive, I think about love, friendship, betrayal, and the twisted web that brought me here. The past is the past. It doesn't define the future, and I will survive. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. See you next time.